to our first lecture of the spring series of literary connections with Mark Schenker. Today, Mark will be speaking about James Baldwin and his essays, The Fire Next Time. So, Mark, if you would like to take it away from me, please, the audience is yours.
Thank you, and thank you very much, Kate. And welcome everybody, or welcome back. I'll say a few things to sort of set us up. One is, it's the nature of this webinar that it can't be as interactive as I would like, and certainly I expected you would like. I did not get into college teaching or this kind of programming, which I've done now for over 30 years, in order to talk at people. I really prefer talking with people. And the concession we have to make in that regard is I will talk in short units and will pause every so many minutes and invite you to ask questions on the chat that Kate will field for me, and I'll do my best to reply to them. And then I'll return to a mini lecture. We'll go on for the 50 or so minutes that we have left. If you have a question that does not get forwarded to me during this session, or that you think of after the fact, later today or in the days ahead, if you send it to my email, which Kate will provide to you, I will do my best to answer promptly. It may be that the answer is I don't know. So I'll say two things that I think I could do for you this evening. One is to point out some of the structural aspects of the essays. What a literature person who was as interested in form as content as I am, that is, I'm interested in both, might notice that you might not be so inclined to notice. And then the other thing I can do for you is put the work in the context of social thinking about the African-American experience in America, especially by other African-Americans. When I say those two things, I don't pretend that I know things or am seeing things that some of you don't. But it's likely that I know or see some things that all of you don't. And so that's what I'm going to share. I am hopeful that when it comes to the actual content of what he is describing and what he is arguing for, because the nature of this kind of essay, one appeared in the journal The Progressive, the other appeared in the magazine, The New Yorker, both in the early 1960s when Baldwin, born in 1924, was in his late 30s. Both of these essays make a kind of argument. For one, the audience is his nephew, and you know the writer Ta-Nehisi Coates published a book a few years ago called Between the World and Me, taking that phrase from the first essay in this book. The phrase occurs on page 27, where James the elder says to James the younger that fears rose up like a wall between the world and me and drove me into the church. And Coates is telling his son, not his nephew, and writing it at about the same age that author was as this author was, what is it that comes between the world and, in these cases, a Black man? So I want to say a couple of things about the structure of the two essays and leave the broader discussion about where James Baldwin's argument falls in the history of African-American argument about race relations. So the two essays, the first is both autobiographical and very intimate in writing to his nephew. So that's the microcosm, writing to someone who has the same name as him, whose face shows the history of the family, as is so often true in any family. That's the microcosmic view, but the macrocosmic is the letter is written on the eve of the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation. And we'll talk about what it is that that essay does. Remarkably, it ends with redefining the idea of integration. And even though the full-fledged civil rights movement is beginning and hasn't reached its zenith, By 1963, the issue of not only Black America, but what Black intellectuals and artists and activists and others, Black politicians, have to contribute to the question of what was then called the Negro Problem, a phrase that Baldwin himself uses. The second essay, the longer essay, Down at the Cross, is about the relationship of religion, not only to Baldwin's own experience. So again, it is both autobiographical and it also has a polemical, that is making an argument dimension. And here the audience is broader than just his nephew, as if he starts simply and briefly, more intimately talking to an adolescent, and then expands his argument to include not just the whole country, but the whole world. And certainly one meaning of Down at the Cross is what is the legacy of Christ's suffering and sacrifice to those who survived him, those weeping and grieving at the cross, many of whom in the tradition are figured as women. And in the second section of the book, Down at the Cross, he talks about his own experience with religion. And that section has three parts. The first, his own experience as a boy preacher and his eventual disillusionment with Christianity. If you have the edition that I have, that is vintage, it looks like this. Not that you have to have it. That section runs from page 15 to 47. He says again that the fears that he would become one of the kinds of lives, the very limited kinds of lives that he saw in his neighborhood, where it was so automatic that wanting to be moral would not keep you from a life of criminality. Very, very powerful, a kind of fatalism, and that he chose the church, what he calls the church racket, as a way to save himself from a different kind of loss. And of course, that happening at 14, that's about the age of initiation in many cultures, Christian or otherwise. And it includes a very, very audacious rejection of Christianity, the more audacious because it's being written and published in 1963. We may take it more matter-of-factly now, but quite an extraordinary thing for the readers of the essay, both for white readers and certainly for many Black readers who associate Christianity with one of the great comforts of their situation, that the love of Jesus, the love of the promise of the afterlife, all of that is richly documented in the African-American experience. And then the second part of the essay, again, autobiographical, but polemical at the same time, autobiographical and I should say rhetorical at the same time. It's making an argument. Rhetorical is a much better word than polemical. Chronicles his meeting with Elijah Muhammad and his several criticisms of the Nation of Islam. And in my edition, the vintage, that runs from pages 47 to 88. So a pretty significant part of the second essay, the longest part of the second essay. And then the third part, the remarkable conclusion, he turns to the American dream and offers his own solution to the Negro problem. That runs from pages 88 to 106, which is the end of the book. So again, the longest section is twice as long as any other in this essay. And I thought I'd stop there for a moment. I don't think book groups are typically experienced in reading essays. This series I designed with Kate's help around the theme of writers born near or in 1920, which is the 100 years ago from when we started this last year, or works that were published in or near 1920. Baldwin qualifies by virtue of his being born in 1924, Next Time, Mrs. Dalloway is published in 1920s, and Eliot's Poems for April, also published in 1920s. The other books we did also had, in one way or another, a connection to the 1920s. More importantly, I designed, again, with Kate's help, the series to give you a range of kinds of literature: a mystery novel, a novel by a Brit, a novel by an American, a nonfiction study about Henrietta Lacks, a nonfiction essay, 2 essays, and then poetry. The only major genre that we haven't covered is drama, and it's just a matter of not being able to do everything. It's my hope that by exercising your reading skills with different genres, different periods, because these works were published at different times, and with different writers, 4 women, 2 men, Black and white, British and American, and so on. So I'm going to pause there and hope that those of you in attendance, however many you are, I don't know how many you are, I can't see you, but you're more than me. And if this kind of conversation, this kind of session on such an important topic to America, and especially now, is going to have any value, it's going to depend upon more people talking than just me. So Kate, can I turn it over to you for input from our friends?
Yes, we do have one question that came in from an anonymous attendee. I'm interested in structure of argument and options available to writers. Is the microstructure the most effective argument style, or do some criticize it and think Baldwin should have used any other structure?
Okay, Kate, do me a favor. Just repeat the section. What kind of structure is referred to in the first instance?
Macro/micro.
Okay, so as you can imagine, and do you have the name of the person who asked the question?
No.
Okay, so John or Jane Q. Public, I appreciate that question. I will say that it's impossible to comment on whether this structure is better than any other structure. This is the structure we have. And if I were asked to edit this work, it'd be a very different thing if I were being called upon to say, Mark, can you think of a better way to do this? My view as a teacher is this is the thing that I have, but I do appreciate the question. And I will say that I think that one thing that's very effective in any kind of literary work, including argument, including rhetoric, an op-ed article in the New York Times or in the New Yorker, or most any kind of argument, including a campaign speech, is if you can get your listeners or readers' attention by having them think of oppositions. So obviously, the clear opposition in a essay like this, you're going to hear me sometimes refer to it as a poem. I'll explain why I slip into that later. Obviously, the main difference is between black and white. That's the obvious one. But if you can add to it the idea of Christianity versus anti-Christianity, that is, leaving the church or denying the Christian God, which is what he suggests, then you have a different kind of tension. If you can talk about Islam, or more importantly, more narrowly, the Nation of Islam as an image of something radically different from Christianity, and certainly radically different and fearful to many readers, including white intellectuals, the readers of the progressive upper middle class and upper class whites reading the New Yorker in the 1960s, the idea of the Nation of Islam as an anti-Christian, not just anti-white, but anti-Christian, forms another kind of opposition. And then the radical suggestion he makes at the end about the solution to the Negro problem also sets itself up as a radical contradiction. And the reason I've gone a great length to this in answer to my anonymous questioner, again, I appreciate the question, is I think works of art, literary works of art, always do best when they can situate themselves in a tension between this and that. That is not to argue just one thing, but to argue the tension between things, not just black and white, not just Christianity and the rejection of Christianity, not just the Nation of Islam versus Christianity, or the Nation of Islam versus the rejection of it, and the opposition that I'm not going to name because we'll talk about it later in the last section. What you find then is the work has a kind of dynamic equilibrium. That is, it gets its balance through opposing forces, whether it's micro or macro or anything else. And he does all those things. And the way that I explain this to my undergraduates is, if you take a violin or guitar string and you hold it so it dangles, you hold it at one end and it dangles, you can pluck it forever and you won't get any sound out of it. You certainly won't get anything close to music. But if you can make it taut by pulling it in two directions, and then you touch it, you pick at it, you pluck it, you make it sing. And I really do think works of art find their power in the opposition. So when you read a play like Othello, if you only like Othello and only hate Iago, you're not experiencing how much Shakespeare admires the creative wickedness, the inventiveness, the maliciousness of Iago, and how critically he is of the sort of insipid goodness of Othello. One's a hero and one's a villain, but they have very different qualities from just off-the-rack heroes and villains. Once you animate someone's experience of a play, a poem, a novel into expressing the opposition, you make the play, the poem, the novel come alive. And that's what I think Baldwin does in this remarkably economical, very short, whatever edition you have, you might have noticed, not many words on a page and not many pages, a remarkable thing for a work that was hailed in its day and still now as one of the most important contributions to social conversations about race in America. Kate, while I was talking, did another question come in?
No, I don't see any other questions so far.
Okay, so again, I don't want anyone in the audience ever to think that my over-inviting is meant as a scold. It's not. I want to just make it clear that as I talk, I'm aware that you might have something to say, and I'm going to pause again in a few minutes to invite you. I do think that this would be an important issue to read and talk about in 2021, even if America and the world was in a much better situation than it is with respect to race. Unfortunately, it's not better as good as it could be. So one way to think about this book is the macro perspective that I'm going to talk about now, and that is to put it in the kind of cultural context of debates that African-American artists, intellectuals, activists, etc., have had about, again, I'm using the Negro problem because that's the phrase used in the book and used at the time. You understand that I understand it's no longer politically correct, but we're talking about history. So to appreciate the remarkable position that James Baldwin took, you have to know something about two strains of African-American social thought that came into focus at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. One of them was that of Booker T. Washington, a name that I expect all of you know, born in 1856, so just before the Civil War, died in 1915. So he did not have a long life, but he had an extraordinary influence. He preached to his fellow African Americans the need for self-help, for racial solidarity, but not at the expense of accommodation. He was not a separatist. He believed that the way the Black man, Black people could advance themselves is by accepting discrimination for the time being, elevate themselves via hard work and material prosperity, aim to join the middle class, acquire marketable skills, and practice the virtues of patience and thrift, patience and thrift, so that white America will be impressed by you and welcome you as a peer. This was a very popular dimension, certainly after the Civil War, and as the South moved through and then out of Jim Crow, the idea that the way out was a way up, and that if you aspired to what some people who are critical of this philosophy called white values, you will be recognized as brothers, as a co-equal with the white majority. His major critic was a writer I'm sure you've also heard of, W.E.B. Du Bois, D-U-B-O-I-S, who lived a longer life, born in 1868, just after the war, and died in 1963. That is just the year this book was published, at the age of 94 or 95. And Du Bois preached political action and a vigorous civil rights agenda. He was one of the co-founders of the NAACP. And he believed not in accommodation, not in accepting discrimination, even for the time being, and believed that the only way up and out would be if African Americans set themselves against the white majority and developed within the African American community and race a small group of talented and college educated Blacks that he called the talented 10th, a kind of germ of intellectual and social activity that would season, leaven the movement so that they could oppose white cultural values and not accommodate themselves to it. The Washington approach came to be seen as conservative, and the Du Bois approach came to be seen as radical. You can be sure that James Baldwin, writing this book, one of the leading writers and intellectuals in America of any race, is deeply aware of that divide in thinking by African Americans about African Americans. And when we turn to the third section of the second essay, you'll see how radical he is in coming up with yet a third way. So I'm going to pause again, since we're nearing the bottom of the hour, the half hour, and welcome Kate back to see if there are other questions.
No, Mark, I don't see any other questions so far.
Okay. So again, I'll continue talking and understand that I have your permission. So he tells his nephew at the end of the first letter that the problem with white Americans is that they don't know that they're guilty. They are blithely unaware of the advantage that they have, even when they don't think they're pressing that advantage, and that their innocence of their crime is the worst crime. The fact that white America doesn't know how badly it is treating and destroying the lives of hundreds of thousands, as he says on page 5 of my text. That's the crime. He knows, that is the author, what white America doesn't know. And he wants his nephew to understand that the innocence, that is white people, in their innocence, in their inactivity, in their inertia, in their acceptance of the status quo, treat Black people as a worthless human being. And James, the elder, says to the younger James, you will be expected to make peace with mediocrity. And he tells his nephew to arm himself with his own experience, trust nobody's word, including his uncle's, and says that what he must do is, I'm going to read this from page 8, there is no reason for you to try to become like white people. That's the Booker T. Washington Avenue. And there is no basis whatever for their impertinent assumption that they must accept you. The really terrible thing, old buddy, is that you must accept them. And I mean that very seriously. You must accept them and accept them with love. This is page 8. This is very early in the text. And this is a remarkable thing that James Baldwin's central message in The Fire Next Time, which of course comes from the Old Testament, and the notion that the first destruction is going to be a cleansing one by water. But if you don't get it right, next time the cleansing, the destruction will come by fire. People who did not know the book assumed, in the context of so much violence against and by both races in the 1960s, that this book was implicitly saying, if you don't get it, we are going to burn down your cities. He's talking in a much broader, much more biblical and philosophical notion that we have this chance to transform ourselves through a kind of cleansing. And at the heart of that transformation is love. Ladies and gentlemen, you have to believe me when I say, some of you I'm sure are old enough and were aware enough of what was going on. People weren't talking about love of the other race in this crucible of 1960s. He says, you must accept them and accept them with love, for these innocent people have no other hope. Now, when he says innocent, he really means naive. Remember, he thinks they're guilty of a crime, and the crime is synonymous with their innocence. Love is the only hope. And he says many of them indeed know better. That is, if you ask them, they know that the imbalance in power is a crime. But as you will discover, people find it very difficult to act on what they know. That's certainly wisdom. To act is to be committed, and to be committed is to be in danger. In this case, the danger in the minds of most white Americans is the loss of their identity. If I'm talking to anyone in the group who has not read this essay, I want to tell you, this is page 9, no better indication of the brilliance that is in this essay than saying the danger in the minds of most white Americans is the loss of their identity. It may not be conscious, but for many people who would not think of themselves as racist, and certainly wouldn't think of themselves as actively racist, and certainly wouldn't think of themselves as being hateful to people of other races, the problem is in their innocence, in their inertia, in their passivity. They shore up an identity that's based on injustice without being able to realize it. And he says he understands that what that would mean for white America is that they would have to transform the world. But he says that we, Black people, can with love force our brothers. Now, he doesn't mean other Black people. He doesn't mean other Black men. He means white people. That with love, we shall force our brothers to see themselves as they are, to cease fleeing from reality and begin to change. We will have an unassailable and monumental dignity. This is the end of that first section. That is a radical redefinition of integration, not to bring the races together in some blend or harmonizing, whether it's the way that Booker T. Washington saw it by example, or the way that Du Bois saw it by a civil rights agenda, but by love, so that whites see themselves as they are. I cannot tell you how radically different this was from anything that was being spoken about publicly or privately in 1962, 1963. I'll stop there for a moment. I think another few minutes have passed, and just check on my co-host.
We do have a question. In the essay, does his nephew receive or reject the wisdom offered by Baldwin?
You mean in biographical, historical terms? I confess I don't know. It's an excellent question, and I suspect it's easy enough to find out. I really do mean it's an excellent question. As some of you may know, whenever someone tells you it's an excellent question, they mean they don't have a good answer. I don't know the answer to that. My own thinking is, even though I think he was absolutely sincere in wanting to give this advice to his nephew, I think of the audience as so much broader than just his nephew, that if it turned out that his nephew turned a deaf ear to this, it wouldn't change anything about my feeling about the book, which is not to say it's still not an interesting question. I assume that if the questioner, the person who put the question to me this evening, is an internet person, it would be easy enough to find out, but I regret that I don't know the answer.
We have another one. Is Baldwin taking away identity of whites by saying they don't know?
Well, I think what he's doing is he is identifying them. He is defining their identity based on their ignorance. I'm going to be autobiographical very briefly here because this is the best explanation I can give you. I'm a father of three. They're all now in their 30s or 40s. But when my eldest was little, we were watching a TV show where a good person, it was clear for even a 6-year-old that this person was good, was thrown into prison, not for racial injustice, just was imprisoned as part of this TV movie, whatever it was. And my daughter, Elizabeth, was very confused and said to me, I thought he was a good person. And I had to explain that good people sometimes wind up in jail. And this led to a very, the kinds of conversations parents live for, a very extended conversation over days about the nature of good people versus bad people. And at dinner, a few days later, again, she was my eldest, maybe 6 or 7 at this time, she asked me if I thought there were more good people in the world than bad people. And I told her that I was absolutely sure that there were many more good people than bad people. I will tell you that I was watching her mother's face, who was very relieved that her intellectual academic husband did not disillusion their daughter by saying the bad people outnumber the good people. But then I added, the problem is a lot of good people think that being good is enough. Not doing bad things is enough to be good. But the bad people know that the whole point of being bad is to do something about it. That badness is envy and lust and greed. The whole point of being bad is that you use your energy to get stuff, to do stuff. It's the nature of badness to be active. And it's unfortunately too often the nature of goodness to be inert. I hope that's not just an anecdote, but makes the point that I think Baldwin would say many of his American white brothers are comfortable in their own goodness because they don't think of themselves as racist. They honestly believe, and maybe it's true, that they harbored no animosity, but that the system of racism, says Baldwin, is so much in the assumption that your life, my nephew, your life, Black men and women at any age, is dispensable, invisible, mediocre or less. And that's the innocence, that naivete, that inert goodness, that goodness without purpose, that is the enemy. And that the way to get around it is to try to have white America love itself enough to be better. Now, you may think that that is hopelessly idealistic, but that's the nature, as Dr. King would say, of having a dream. That's the nature of thinking big. And one of the arguments that Baldwin makes at the end of the book is it's going to take people who can write about love and beauty, another word that you didn't hear thrown around very much in the political and social discourse of the 1960s. It's going to take people who are focused on love and beauty to transform the world. I hope that's at least a partial answer to your question. And believe me, I am very aware that I am a white American as I speak this. I'm very aware that now that I've gotten to the latter half of my 60s, I am sure that my life has been founded on racism in ways that I benefited from, sometimes my own inertness, sometimes a kind of half-conscious collaboration with the advantages I've had as a white man in 20th and 21st century America. It doesn't mean that I can't understand his argument, because the power of this argument is not that the Black brothers have to listen to Brother James, who used to be a preacher, and rise up and either take the Booker T. Washington way or the W.E. Du Bois way. They have to take a new way. And the new way is to embrace love of white people, to try to convince them to love themselves. That's a new argument coming from a Black writer, and to embrace the beauty that is in the world. He says at the bottom of page 104, when I was very young and was dealing with my buddies in those wine and urine stained hallways, something in me wondered, what will happen to all that beauty? For Black people, though I am aware that some of us, Black and white, do not know it yet, are very beautiful. And when I sat at Elijah's table, Elijah Muhammad, and watched the baby, the women, and the men, and we talked about God's or Allah's vengeance, I wondered, when that vengeance was achieved, what will happen to all that beauty then? I could also see that the intransigence and ignorance of the white world might make that vengeance inevitable, a vengeance that does not really depend on and cannot be really executed by any person or organization, and cannot be prevented by any police force or army. And it goes on to say that it's not enough to try to take vengeance. It's not enough to be violent, because it just breeds more violence. Everything now, we must assume, is in our hands, and we have no right to assume otherwise. If we, and now I mean the relatively conscious white and relatively conscious Blacks must, like lovers, insist on, create the consciousness of the other. We have to take the best of us, the ones who are more conscious than others, and use love and beauty. I'm going to read the last lines. We may be able, handful as we are, and there's a nod towards that talented tenth, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country, that is the country of Blacks and whites, change the history of the world. If we do not now dare everything, the fulfillment of that prophecy, recreated from the Bible in song by a slave, is upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time. And again, he's saying that if we don't embrace the love and beauty, the option is vengeance and violence. And he means especially the option of Dr. Elijah Muhammad, whose preaching did involve the destruction of the white race. One of the things that made him so fearful to white America, and made him also a worry to some fellow African Americans who thought he was bad for their race. So again, we're coming up on the 3/4 mark, and I'll pause again. And here's Kate back like a public service announcement. Thank you, Kate.
Yes, absolutely. We have two questions that actually mirror each other. How do you see religion here? How extraordinary that Baldwin seems to have rejected Christianity, but at the same time, he seems to have embraced its most fundamental precept, love.
Yeah, well, so I'll say with respect, I was raised a Christian. I still consider myself a Christian. Love is older than Christianity. And the fact that Christianity does have as one of its central precepts, maybe its central precept, the greatest of these is love, shouldn't blind us to the fact that love was true before Christianity and certainly outside of Christianity. One of the things he dislikes about Christianity is this notion of setting up oppositions, not being all embracing. And I do think it is as I said earlier, and as this questioner is suggesting, a radical and audacious proposition to state so baldly in 1962 and 63 that this God of Christianity needs to be discarded. You know, if he were writing a novel like The Invisible Man, or if he were writing a play like the extraordinary plays later on of August Wilson about the African American experience in America through 10 plays, one set in each decade of the 20th century, mostly in Pittsburgh, his hometown, you could say, oh, he's being subtle about it. He's being indirect in his suggestion. No, he is bald and audacious in saying, we may have to throw over that God. And then as he turns to have a meal with Dr. Elijah Muhammad, the first time reader might think, oh, I see where he's going. And then he shocks Muhammad by rejecting that path as well. You were saying that the two questions were alike enough. Is there something else to say about the second question, or is there another question?
No, yeah, I think that you answered it, yeah, both really well.
Okay, so what I want to say about this radical redefinition of what integration means, and also about his bringing up the notion of salvaging the beauty of the African American race, the beauty of all people. And I'm going to read again earlier in the end. Here we are at the center of the arc, trapped in the gaudiest, most valuable, and most improbable water wheel the world has ever seen. And I'm going to, everything now we must assume is in our hands. We have no right to assume otherwise. That is, it's a responsibility to take this moment when the world seems to be giving at least some attention to African American social, political, and philosophical thought. If we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and relatively conscious blacks, who must, like lovers, remarkable, insist on or create the consciousness of the other, if we do not falter in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare, achieve our country, and change the history of the world. So what is this saying? It's arguing in a country that prides itself on democracy, on the democratic ideal, but recognizes that the American dream is about getting ahead. And the only way to get ahead is to leave some other people behind. One of the great paradoxes, one of the great creative, dynamic oppositions in American culture is about majority rule and minority rights. And the notion that all people are created equal, but the implicit parentheses, but some are more equal than others. And what he is acknowledging is that there is a kind of talented tenth, but it's not the people who have gone to college. It's not the people who have become entrepreneurs and movers and shakers. He's redefining what W.E. Du Bois had in mind, and he's suggesting that only people, the handful, the relatively few on both sides of the racial divide, who can speak in terms of love and beauty. And those people include, first and foremost, in Baldwin's unspoken agenda, artists, people who imagine, people who can write an essay like this that is filled with beauty and with love. If we were doing this in a college course in which we were reading literary essays to improve the class's ability to write their own literary essays, we would be looking closely, and it would take a lot more than the 50 minutes that I've had this evening to point out just how lovely, how beautiful, aesthetically, artistically, and how loving these essays are. A remarkable thing when we consider when they were published and what people picking up the essay either in their two separate venues or in the collected book that was published in 1963. I think that's the agenda that James Baldwin has in mind, that it is, among other disciplines, art that's going to transform America. And if we step back, I don't know how many African Americans are with us this evening. I don't mean to say they have a special obligation to speak up, but I hope if they want to, they will. If we step back at a moment and think about white America and how much the contributions of African American, now contributions in many, many fields. I'm only talking now about literary art because that's what Baldwin practiced. If we think about how much African American contributions in the arts, in writing, whether it's rapping or plays or screenplays or directing, and then you expand that to other kinds of popular culture and entertainment, whether it's music awards or Broadway or rapping, the experience in, well, I'll leave it at that for now. Think about how much white America has depended, again, I'm saying narrowly in terms of literary expression, because that's what Baldwin practiced. You could imagine an argument for these leaders, Black and white, trying to get together on the basis of love and beauty to transform the world. And again, if your reaction, as is completely understandable, well, this is a pie in the sky, this is hoping too much, it's often the people who imagine beyond the possible, and again, I think now of Dr. King, who, son of a gun, get it right. So, Kate, if there is another question out there, I'm happy to take it.
Yes, we do have a couple of questions. The first one is, why was Baldwin's experience so relatable across the country? And why did he live in France?
So I'm not sure his experience was so relatable across the country. You don't become a popular, you don't become a bestseller publishing your work in the New Yorker and the Progressive. And you don't become a bestseller publishing a book in 1963 with the title The Fire Next Time, when there are other titles like Burn, Baby, Burn, and you have Eldridge Cleaver, you have the Black Panthers eventually, you have a lot of radicalism that rightly or wrongly has terrified the broad American public. His movement to France had much to do with his own homosexuality, with his feeling that as much as he wanted to preach a harmony, that he was still a Black man in white America. We know in the last, say, dozen years of high profile internet and social media cases of how easy it is for a Black person to be killed by institutional powers, not just by gangs of marauding youths or by a quote unquote accident, but by the system, by the man. We know that we now have a greater angle of vision on those instances than people did even 20 years ago. Imagine what it'd be like in the 1960s to be a Black man. I say man because he's a man, a Black man in white America. So I'm sure his reasons for living in France were more complicated than that. I confess to you that when I prepare for a session like this, knowing I only have less than an hour, I put all of my focus into the work in front of me and try to do the two things I've tried to do. Read how it's structured, read into it, read in it, delve into it, and then pull back and try to put it onto the landscape of American social thought. In fact, I'll say to all of you, in the same notion of the tensions that animate life, I'm a very big fan of that idea, that there are two broad ways you can consider literary works. There are many, but I'm going to narrow it to these two. One is you can look into the work as if you were mining ore from some sort of site. you can delve into the meaning, the structure, the language, the form, the diction. You can study it in what used to be called close reading, that is focusing only on the work in front of you and being a kind of geologist delving into the depths of its meaning. But you can also take a different view and be more like a topographer. Say, I want to plot where this work stands, what space it occupies in the terrain of African American relations or American literary essays, or whatever terrain you might be looking at. And of course, the work exists in both forms. To get the fullest comprehension of any work of art, it's good to know something about it in itself, and it's good to know something about it in a context where it's influenced by, for example, Du Bois and Washington, just as Coates's essay is absolutely influenced and informed by these essays. You had another question, Kate?
Yes, I do. Baldwin in this book often portrays Americans as immature. Other cultures, European for example, also see us as charming but childish. Was his view of Americans influenced by his time spent in Europe?
Yeah. Again, it's a question I'm not competent to answer. And I have my own opinions about European notions of American, but it has nothing to do with my literary abilities or our conversation this evening. I want to say again, those are excellent questions. And when I say they're excellent questions, I'm not just trying to be patronizing. Almost always when I'm with a group of people who are asking questions, they come up with more angles on the work than I'm prepared to talk about. I always think that's a very good thing. For one thing, it reminds me that I don't know it all. And it also reminds me of what I believe fervently, and maybe Kate, you'll let me have this be my curtain line, that I tell my own children and I tell my students, college age, high school age, or adults, that if you want to become a better reader, it's not enough to read more books. You have to spend more time with other readers. And so I have never had a week of doing book events. This week I'm doing 4, that I have not learned something from a question or a statement from somebody in the discussion group, whether it's one of my private groups that used to meet in people's homes, and I hope will again, or whether it's this kind of format and venue, something that I didn't know before or never thought about. It is always better in your literary education to read books and talk about them with other people. And I am fond of giving the example that if you answer the question, what is the novel Gone with the Wind about? And you say, well, it's about the American Civil War, you're right. But if you were talking to someone who said, well, you know, my grandmother, my mother, my aunt remembers very well when this book came out in the late 1930s. And what she remembers about it is she thought it was speaking to her experience as someone going hungry in the American Depression. And that when Scarlett says, I'll never go hungry again, she wasn't talking about the 1860s. Margaret Mitchell was talking about the 1930s. And I remember that person saying that if it wasn't for someone in the group mentioning what her relative saw, she never would have thought of Gone with the Wind as a novel about the American Depression. And it is. As much as there's racism in the book, because Margaret Mitchell seems to be bemoaning that what is gone with the wind is plantation culture, on some level, she's talking about the very basic human experience of how you feel when what you know is gone. And certainly people in the 1930s in America who believed in the American dream felt that that dream was gone with the wind. And it's so instructive to think that it's other people who can remind us of what we've missed in the first place, that the novel Gone with the Wind is partly about the American Depression. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, everybody, for coming, for your attention, and for your questions and comments. I'm very grateful.
Thank you very much, and we hope to see you next month, March 25th, Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. Thank you. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you for your wonderful, thoughtful questions. And thank you, Mark, as usual. Wonderful presentation.
Thanks, Kate. Good night, all.
Good night.